Good afternoon, and welcome to today's presentation featuring Bank of Canada Deputy Governor Sharon Kozicki. My name is Dale Eisler. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow here at the Johnson-Suyama School, and I'm going to be the moderator for our discussion. Start with a short plug, which we tend to do these things here at Johnson-Suyama. The school has become a national hub for advanced study and research in public policy administration. We're a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan. Since our inception in 2007, we have become one of Canada's leading policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. I would like to acknowledge as we begin that while today's event is taking place in Regina, Johnson-Suyama's physical homes are in Saskatoon and Regina and are located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. We welcome those joining us today and make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory reside on or are visiting. To help our event to run smoothly, I ask that everyone turn off your phones and electronic devices. I just did mine, actually had forgotten. So please turn them off. And in terms of format, following my brief introductory remarks, Deputy Governor Kozicki will provide about a 30-minute presentation, and there will be slides, Sharon, I believe, right? Visible up here, I hope. Then we'll move to an audience Q&A, and I have a few questions I prepared just to kind of get the discussion going in case people are thinking about questions they want to raise. And if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and one of our staff members will come over with a mic, because this is being recorded and actually live cast on the Bank of Canada website, I believe. So we have a limited amount of time and a lot of people in the room, so I ask that please keep your questions as concise and to the point as possible so we can address as many questions during our time. As I mentioned, this lecture is being recorded and will be available on the Bank of Canada website, and the link to the final recording will be shared with all who have registered. And it'll also be available on the Johnson-Suyama website too. So now that the logistics are out of the way, I'm pleased to introduce Bank of Canada Deputy Governor Sharon Kozicki. Today's lecture, her presentation will focus on how the pandemic affected the finances of different households. Some accumulated more savings and wealth, while others accumulated more debt. Clearly, these variables, coupled with other factors such as supply chain impacts and disruptions, which we're all familiar with, have complicated monetary policy decisions by the bank. Deputy Governor Kozicki brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to monetary policy decision-making. Appointed Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada in August 2021, she oversees the bank's analysis of domestic economic developments, and as a member of the Governing Council, shares responsibility for decisions about monetary policy, the stability of the financial system, and the strategic direction of the bank. At the time of her appointment, Ms. Kozicki was Secretary to the Governing Council and advisor to the Governor on subjects related to the Canadian economy and monetary policy. She also led the bank's review of the monetary policy framework for the 2016 renewal of the inflation targeting agreement with the Government of Canada. Between 2010 and 2013, Ms. Kozicki was Managing Director of the bank's Canadian Economic Analysis Department, responsible for briefing Governing Council about the developments in the Canadian economy to inform monetary policy decisions. She oversaw long-term research on the operation of the economy, inflation, macro-financial linkages, and the transmission channels of domestic and international monetary policies. Ms. Kozicki also serves as Deputy Managing Director of the bank's International Economic Analysis Department between 2008 and 2010. Before joining the bank in 2006, Ms. Kozicki was an economist with the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in Washington, D.C., and Vice President and economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Born in Ottawa, she has a Bachelor of Science degree and a Master's degree in economics from the University of Toronto and a PhD from the University of California, San Diego. So clearly, Ms. Kozicki has a tremendous background in terms of her experience with the bank and financial institutions and monetary policy, as well as her academic training. So I'm now pleased to turn the floor over to Sharon for her presentation.
Good afternoon. I'm going to have to restart, sorry. Donc, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here in Regina and would like to thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. Bonjour à tous. Je suis très heureuse d'être à Regina aujourd'hui et de pouvoir vous adresser la parole. Before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to congratulate a local winner of this year's Bank of Canada Museum Award for Excellence in Teaching Economics. Andre Boutin-Maloney of Bert Fox Community High School in Fort Capel developed an interactive trading post simulation that combined the teaching of Indigenous history and economic principles. Congratulations to Andre and the entire class, and we're lucky today to have with us Andre and his current class. So thank you for coming. Now, the 2024 edition of this award launched recently. So if you know of a deserving economics teacher, you can submit a nomination on the museum's website. So my speech today will review how the events of the past few years have affected households in different ways. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, every household had different levels of income, wealth, and debt. And since the pandemic arrived in Canada in early 2020, economic circumstances have shifted dramatically and repeatedly. Multiple levels of government and the Bank of Canada acted in response. Now, policies and economic developments have shaped the way that individuals and businesses experienced the pandemic and its aftermath. And this, in turn, has influenced our subsequent policy decisions. As we've made decisions in this complex and evolving environment, it's been important to understand how these decisions affect different households and businesses. So let me jump into how the pandemic affected individual households. Aggregate economic data do not always tell the full story. This type of data tells a story of averages, but no household is ever truly average. A household's financial circumstances and spending patterns are as unique as the household itself. Not surprisingly, households experienced the unusual economic events of the past few years in very different ways. Initially, shutdowns forced some businesses to close entirely and others to limit the number of shoppers they welcomed. Simply, people could spend their money in fewer places. And businesses saw their sales and revenues fall, and many workers were laid off. Against this backdrop, governments increased support programs, and the Bank of Canada eased monetary policy. Now, an important development during the pandemic was large swings in both demand and in supply. Initially, demand spiked for goods that could help people navigate the public health crisis. But more generally, demand for many other things plummeted. With people staying home and demand in sharp decline, total inflation was actually bouncing around 0% for several months in 2020. Obviously, that did not last. As many workers settled into a new home-centered life, demand for things like home office equipment and sporting goods soared. But new challenges began to emerge. Household spending on goods rebounded quite quickly, especially on items that could be ordered online. But supply was constrained by disruptions to global supply chains. We had seen some supply chain disruptions before, but never anything on such a global scale and affecting as many goods and services. With strong demand and constrained supply, prices for some goods began to rise, and this was an early inflationary force. Around the same time, an unprecedented boom in real estate activity began to take root and drove house prices to record highs across the country. Similar dynamics were occurring in many other countries. Lockdowns had allowed many middle income and upper income households to accumulate a significant amount of savings. These increased savings, along with low interest rates and a desire for more living space, fueled the demand. But the boom affected individual households in starkly different ways, and these differences have continued to influence our policy deliberations. Here's why. About 2/3 of Canadian households own their home, and the home equity of these households increased as house prices rose, so their wealth went up. But some households took on high levels of mortgage debt to finance real estate purchases in a market that strongly favored sellers. And while the boom eventually slowed, one of the lasting legacies is that some households have higher home equity, and some have much higher levels of debt, and some have both. The context in which this occurred is important. Even before the pandemic, interest rates had been very low for a long time, and some households accumulated considerable debt. The current elevated debt levels have affected how higher interest rates influence individual households and have changed the relative importance of the channels through which monetary policy is transmitted. So let me delve a bit more into the details about the channels of monetary policy transmission and why one of them has been having an unusually large effect during this tightening cycle. The simple way of thinking about how monetary policy works is that when we raise the policy interest rate, other interest rates also tend to go up, and the Canadian dollar often appreciates. These effects slow both domestic demand and net exports and reduce price pressures. But a lot's really going on under the hood. While increases in interest rates tend to slow demand, the impact of these rate increases differs across households, and those differences can influence the ways that monetary policy takes effects. So far, the largest impacts have been associated with what is known as a cash flow or income channel. This partly reflects the fact that households whose debt service costs vary with interest rates like prime have felt large direct impacts. And to date, about 15% of households have a higher mortgage payment than they did in February 2022 due to interest rate increases. As time goes on, more people will be renewing their mortgages, so more households will face higher payments. Let me add that actually a similar dynamic may be driving up rents. Landlords with mortgages may also be facing higher interest costs and may be passing them along to renters. In addition, the higher mortgage rates makes it more difficult to qualify for a mortgage, which may push some households into the rental market. The average rent across Canada was up over 6% in August. Higher interest rates increase the carrying cost of debt that people already have. Households with variable rate mortgages and variable payments feel this effect almost immediately when rates rise. So do people with bank loans with variable interest rates, such as home equity lines of credit. Higher shelter costs and debt payments mean that people have less income left over to spend on other things, like restaurants or vacations. So far, this cash flow channel has not only had the largest effects, it's also been more important than in past cycles. I'll get to why shortly. So traditionally, the main channel through which monetary policy affects demand has been a change in the timing of people's spending. So to understand this channel, it's important to use the concept of real interest rates. So what is a real interest rate? Well, it's the level of the interest rates that you might hear about a lot, but you have to subtract off expected inflation. The stance of monetary policy, as measured by real interest rates, entered restrictive territory only recently in the wave of both a higher policy rate and declining inflation expectations. So now these real interest rates influence the choice between buying something now or delaying the purchase to a future date. The basic idea is that when real interest rates are high, the return on savings is high compared with expected increase in prices. So instead of buying something now, you could earn interest on your savings, make the purchase in the future, and end up with some money left over. So now whether they're viewed as increasing the costs of borrowing or increasing the return to savings, Higher real interest rates help reduce demand in the economy, and that helps bring inflation down. So there's a third channel as well through which policy rate increases can soften demand. It's called a wealth effect. When interest rates increase, the value of many assets, such as houses and stocks, tend to decline. Now, when consumers see their wealth decline, they may pull back on spending. So while asset prices may respond relatively quickly to higher interest rates, the impact of decreasing wealth on consumption does tend to be slower. Now, we take all of these channels into account when we're setting monetary policy and when we're monitoring how well it's working. So we have seen demand slow since we started increasing the policy interest rate. Now, the slowing started in the housing sector, but subsequently spread to spending on other interest-sensitive goods. It also showed up as weaker growth of borrowing. On the savings side, we've seen a shift in personal deposits toward term deposits. Term deposits tend to have higher interest rates. So those are the blue bars that are getting bigger in this chart. And we've seen both consumer price index, we call that CPI for short, so CPI inflation, and core inflation decline. I'll talk more about core in a minute. But as we've been making decisions, we've been faced with novel challenges in setting monetary policy. So the truth is that the past 2 years have been the biggest test of our inflation targeting framework. So this framework was introduced in 1991. Since then, inflation has sometimes been above the upper end of our inflation control range of 1% to 3%. But these episodes tended to be short-lived and were frequently associated with temporary surges in only a subset of prices. This time has been different. The biggest difference is that inflation rose to a much higher level, and it has exceeded the control range for longer. As well, outsized increases in prices have been widespread. People at all income levels have been affected, and the effects don't always link directly to a household's income level. Higher fuel prices have disproportionate effects for people who live in parts of the country where they heat their homes with oil or where they need to drive long distances. And certain sectors of the economy are impacted much more than others. Agriculture, for example, makes extensive use of gasoline and diesel fuel, and farmers will feel the pinch of higher energy prices much more than most. The second big difference this time is where things were when all of this started. Before the pandemic, we'd been in an environment of low interest rates for over a decade. Low interest rates made it easier for households to borrow more money. Average household debt levels were high entering the pandemic. Then, during the pandemic, even as some households used excess savings to pay down debt, low interest rates encouraged others to borrow more. Because debt was elevated and rates had been so low for so long, the cash flow has been much more important than in the past. Low for long, in particular, implies that all 5-year fixed-rate mortgages issued before 2022 will likely face significantly higher interest rates when they are renewed. This is what has been happening, and it could continue for another 3.5 years. The resulting drag on spending could last even longer. A third difference, as I mentioned earlier, is that during the pandemic, some households gained home equity wealth. Some gained stock market wealth, and some just consumed a lot less than usual and built up their savings. In other words, pull it all together, it's a pretty complicated situation. Because inflation was very high last year, interest rates had to rise a lot. And that's why we forcefully and brought them up quickly. Inflation's come down, but it's still too high. And that tends to mean that real interest rates need to remain high. The current level inflation is not the only relevant factor, though. Balancing the pandemic paradox of accumulated debt and accumulated wealth has been a defining feature of monetary policy during this cycle of tightening. The combination of elevated savings and pent-up demand can mean that some households have more desire and ability to spend, and their spending is less sensitive to rising interest rates. The other side of the pandemic paradox is that when households have a lot of debt, their spending is more sensitive to rising interest rates. So gauging the overall impact of these changes on the transmission of monetary policy is key to determining the appropriate degree of tightening. So this is just one part of the story behind why we dedicate a lot of time to monitoring detailed data about borrowing, spending, and savings. By using a diverse set of sources of information, we're able to understand more about what's happening at a detailed level and evaluate richer alternative scenarios that put different weights on these different household experiences. For instance, from our analysis of anonymized microdata, we know that some households, such as those with variable interest rates and variable mortgage payments, have been really challenged by higher mortgage payments. We've not yet seen a disproportionate increase in mortgage delinquencies for this group, but we do know that the share of indebted households falling behind on payments for at least 60 days on any credit product has risen sharply since the beginning of last year and essentially back to its pre-pandemic level. We need to be aware that sometimes special circumstances merit a deeper dive to understand the data. For instance, even though survey data told us that many households are struggling, aggregate consumption was very strong in the first quarter. We assessed that this outcome partly reflected a number of special factors, including pent-up demand for services, delayed delivery of some pre-ordered durable goods, and strong population growth. Earlier this month, we decided to keep the policy interest rate at 5%. Recent data have provided evidence that our policy rate increases are slowing demand. Household credit growth has eased as the impact of higher interest rates restrained spending among a wider range of borrowers. In the second quarter, a marked weakening in consumption growth and a decline in housing activity contributed to a sharp slowing of economic growth. We're mindful that past increases in interest rates will continue to weigh on activity. On the inflation front, CPI inflation has decreased significantly. It went from a high of 8.1% in June 2022 to 2.8% in June of this year, though it rose to 3.3% in July and 4% in August. Ups and downs of the size we've seen in the past couple of months are not that unusual and are one of the reasons why we look at measures of core inflation to get a sense of what underlying inflation is. Core inflation is a measure of inflation that excludes components with more volatile price movements. Measures of core inflation have eased, but recent CPI data indicate that inflationary pressures are still broad-based. The number of components of the CPI with price increases greater than 3%, 5%, 7% are all lower than they had been, but they're all still much higher than they usually are when inflation is stable and close to 2%. More generally, underlying inflation has experienced little recent downward momentum. The inflation side of things is complex. We examine the details of what's happening to prices within the basket of goods and services in the CPI, not just the overall inflation rate. For instance, we know that mortgage interest costs have risen with increases in our policy interest rate, and that these costs have risen by more over the past year than any other component of the CPI. This is partly because mortgage rates were so low for so long. Now, some have argued that because movements in our policy interest rate can directly and immediately impact some mortgage rates, we should exclude this component when looking at inflation. Indeed, one of our measures of core inflation, one advantage of our measures of core inflation is that they exclude extreme price changes, be they increases or decreases. CPI trim, as we call it, is one of the ways that we measure core inflation. And even though this measure has been excluding mortgage interest costs for more than a year, in recent months, it's been at about 3.5% to 4%. There are some who think that, as an upward distortion could exist as long as mortgage interest costs are even part of this basket of goods and services in the CPI. So for them, I'm just going to provide another calculation. Consider a CPI basket that has all the same goods and services in it, other than mortgage interest costs. Apply the methodologies that we use to calculate core inflation to this slightly smaller basket. When we do this, we find that the new measures of core inflation are indeed lower, but only by about 1/4 percentage point. That is, underlying inflation is still well above the level that would be consistent with achieving our target of 2% CPI inflation. So let me conclude. When making monetary policy decisions, the Bank of Canada must consider the many ways that shifting economic circumstances affect different households. We don't set our policy based on what is happening to one set of households or to the price of any one good or service. But we do our best to understand what is going on at a detailed level. This helps us to do a better job of forecasting where the economy is likely to be headed and helps us balance risks. Quand elle prend ses décisions de politique monétaire, la Banque du Canada doit tenir compte des multiples façons dont l'évolution du contexte économique touche les différents ménages. Nous n'établissons pas notre politique en fonction de ce qui arrive à un sous-ensemble des ménages ou au prix d'un bien ou service en particulier. Mais nous faisons de notre mieux pour saisir ce qui se produit de manière plus détaillée. Cela nous aide à mieux prévoir la trajectoire probable de l'économie et à mettre en balance les risques. We monitor inflation from a wide variety of sources as we balance the risks of over and under tightening monetary policy. We know that if we don't do enough now, we'll likely have to do even more later. And we also know that if we tighten too much, we risk unnecessarily hurting the economy. So we don't make these decisions lightly. We know that higher interest rates have been painful for some. We also know the burden of persistently high inflation weighs on households of all income levels and in every part of the country. We're seeing signs that monetary policy is working. Both inflation and inflation expectations have come down, and excess demand in the economy is easing. Our past policy actions will continue to have an effect as they work their way through the economy. However, in our most recent monetary policy decision, we also expressed concern about the persistence of underlying inflation. We'll continue to evaluate whether the evolution of excess demand, inflation expectations, wage growth, and corporate price-setting behavior are consistent with achieving the 2% inflation target. And we're prepared to raise the policy interest rate further if needed. Making monetary policy decisions requires both thoughtful consideration and decisive action. We know that the reasons behind the bank's decisions are not always obvious to the public, and I hope that I've been able to provide some light on how we've been approaching these decisions. We carefully consider information from a variety of sources, conduct extensive supplementary research, and take into account the many different ways monetary policy affects Canadians. Canada's experience with inflation targeting has shown that low, stable, and predictable inflation is the means by which monetary policy can best promote the economic and financial welfare of Canadians. It's our responsibility to bring inflation back to the 2% inflation target, and the bank remains resolute in its commitment to restoring price stability for Canadians. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Sharon. That was fascinating. And while people are thinking about some questions, maybe I could just kind of get the discussion started. And you mentioned in your remarks about the August CPI inflation rate of 4%, which was just announced by Statistics Canada this morning, I believe. Just curious about your thoughts on that, because it was, I think, higher than most forecasts, slightly, that people thought.
Yeah.
And can you give us any sense of sort of what the bank would, how you would respond to that, or how you think about it in terms of policy decisions going forward?
Yeah. So certainly, just to go back to, we look into the details in the data. Actually, I wonder if I should stand up.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Or I'm just worried I can't see people at the back. So we always do look at the data in detail to try to understand what it all means. And one thing that's important to keep in mind on the inflation data is it can be really volatile from month to month, right? That's part of the reason why I talked about trying to find these measures that exclude some of that volatility and look through the middle, right? So why am I talking about that now? I mentioned the numbers, right? 2.8 in this overall CPI inflation number back in June, then 3.3, and then 4, right? So this is not something that anybody in this room, frankly, would like to see. Inflation is getting higher. But it is important to look underneath and understand the details. One of the big drivers in inflation this month was coming from energy and gasoline costs, right? So why do I want to draw attention to that? That's one of those pieces that can be pretty volatile, right? So we have seen oil prices on global markets go up, and we've seen energy costs go up with that increase. And that's one of the reasons that relative to what we had seen earlier in this year, today's number, it looks a lot higher, right? And so we looked at that. We're also going to be looking in more detail. Another thing that went up this month was rent. Over a 12-month period, rent went up by about 5.5% in July, about 6.5% in August, right? Those two pieces are the important pieces for understanding why inflation went up this month. So what is that going to mean for policy? Well, not surprisingly, I'm not going to give you and this is what it means for interest rates answer. And there's a reason for that, because it's going to take a lot of time to sort through how to interpret that data, given everything that's going on underneath the data, but also in the context of other new data we've had since we gave a projection back in July. So we'll be updating our projection in October. We'll be taking our next monetary policy decision near the end of October. And so we'll be trying to pull all of that information together so that we can see overall what our understanding is of the economy, what's happening in terms of excess demand, what's happening in terms of inflationary pressures, and always with a mind that monetary policy does take time to have some effect. So there's still going to be some effects coming through from actions that we've already taken. So,
Sure. Okay.
We're looking at it. We're mindful of it.
If anybody has a question, just raise your hand, and maybe I'll just ask one more. Just in listening to your presentation, you talked about sort of the household effects and how they varied across the country, and also regional effects and different sectors of the economy. And yet, monetary policy, at least in terms of the application of interest rates, is a pretty blunt instrument. Yeah. And I'm just curious how the bank struggles with that reality, knowing it's affecting different people in different sectors of the economy differently. It's not the same across the country. I would think that's would be a major consideration.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we do take a deep dive in terms of what's happening, by region, what's happening by industry, because things are very different. As I said, we're not setting monetary policy for any one industry, any one region, any one household type, right? Like, we're trying to set it overall. So we're trying to weigh these different things as they happen. And I should mention, even the inflationary experience is very different in different parts of the country at different times. So we need to do something where we're trying to set it on average for Canadians, but recognizing that Canadians aren't truly average, right? So the CPI basket is a basket, it takes a sampling of all sorts of goods that people buy, all sorts of things, services people spend money on, and then tracks what's happening to those prices over time. And it tries to be representative of what's happening in the country. And there are samples taken across the country of different prices that go in. And so that's why we're looking at the CPI. It's more of a national measure, and it's something that does, it's a national measure. No one's going to experience the exact one, but it's really covering sort of this broader experience. It's less likely to be drawn out by something that's happening in just one industry or in just one province. And we try to make sure we have a good picture for that. The other thing that I'll say is sometimes the differences average out a little bit, right? So an individual or one region might experience a higher inflation rate than the national average at one point in time. But the next year, they might find that they're actually experiencing a lower inflation rate, right? And so again, sometimes over time, some of these differences in our ultimate objectives will average out a little bit. So we try to be mindful of that. And it's difficult. I'm going to actually use an old example because I think it might resonate a little bit with this audience. Oil prices back in 2014, 2015 moved a lot. And a lot of that oil is being produced in a few areas of the country. What do we do with monetary policy? Do we recognize those few areas that are really intense in producing oil are going to be having a much harder time? Do we look at just the national data? Well, you know what we did? We looked very carefully at how the changes in the oil prices were not only impacting the regions where the oil was produced, but how that was going through supply chains and affecting the whole country. And you can look back at the decisions that we took back in 2015. We did lower the interest rate, even though it was something that was coming out of initially, an oil price. But it looked like it was going to be a pretty persistent move, and it was impacting in the end, to different degrees, a lot of provinces, right? Manufacturing that might be feeding into investment in some of the regions producing oil, just as one example. So I wanted to use that example because I feel like it helps answer that regional question a little bit.
Okay. Any questions? Right here. We got a microphone.
Microphone's coming.
And do you mind just sort of stating your name?
Sure. Brett Dalter, Assistant Professor in the Department of Economics. Thanks for visiting us here. So I wanted to get a sense of, when you're doing your deep dive, what's the contribution of some of these global factors? So you see global oil prices. So how much of our inflation is an experience shared with other countries, and how much can you do about that when you're setting a national policy that, maybe you are working to coordinate with other banks around the world, but maybe just a sense of how much is domestic inflation due to our own circumstances, how much is driven by international conditions that's affecting other countries?
Yeah, so that's a really big question, and hits in different ways. So first thing, we're not coordinating across countries in terms of monetary policy, but you will have observed over the past several years that many countries are experiencing very similar things. So we've seen countries across the world tightening up monetary policy in an attempt to bring down inflation. So now let's think about some of those global factors from the Canadian perspective, right? When inflation started rising above the 2% target in 2021, initially that was coming more from global factors. A lot of it was coming from energy prices that went up a lot, and goods prices. Why? Just as I talked about, strong goods demand in Canada when people were ordering online, it was everywhere, right? All over the world, there was a resurgence in demand for goods that was at the front end. So the goods came up, supply distortions made it difficult to satisfy that demand, and energy prices were going up. A lot of that 2021 was coming from global sources. After that, however, things started becoming more domestic. And so where can you see that in our own inflation data? Some of that was showing up through what I'll call services excluding the shelter piece, okay? And so the services excluding shelter tends to be a little more tied to what's happening in the Canadian economy. The services is a lot of variety what's inside that thing. But the easy way to think of that is, if people are getting their hair cut, that depends on what's happening locally, right? It doesn't matter what's happening, in a barber shop in Europe, right? Whereas when you're buying a good that's traded internationally, maybe it does matter how much people all over the world want it. So that's a very simple example, just to give that idea that when these services not counting shelter are moving around, that's the domestic. And so things started to swing at the beginning of 2022. And domestic sources started becoming more important. So that was one of the concerns, and you'll see a lot of our messaging in early 2022 about how there was a bit of a shift from global onto the domestic. And that's one of the things that's been very important is monitoring what's going on in the domestic side of things. And so, we then also have to be, this is my final comment on this question, we also have to be very mindful about, even though we can't affect a lot of what happens in terms of globally, that does still impact inflation in Canada, right? And then that feeds through, and people in Canada want to be able to continue to buy the things that they're used to buying. So it feeds through into expectations of inflation. People might think that, well, we've had inflation high for a while now. Even if it started out globally, maybe it's going to stay high. As long as people think it might stay high, that's something that can enter into labor negotiations on wages, And if we don't see productivity and we see the wage gains, it can make inflation persist for longer, right? So we monitor all of that because it's been an evolving story of what's going on. So this time around, since July, we've had energy prices go up. And so that is going to be impacting our outlook for inflation. Why? Because the energy piece itself is based on we make an assumption going forward, and going forward it higher will imply in our forecast by assumption that we're going to see the gasoline prices higher. If energy prices come off a lot between now and when we actually update our outlook, we will be making an assumption on a lower energy price, and we would have lower inflation. So that is one piece in the projection, but we also, as I mentioned earlier, try to monitor a lot of what's happening in that core inflation. The energy price on its own, if it's temporary, is something that gets much less weight because we're concerned about the underlying inflation.
Question over here, I think.
Hi, my name's Sylvia O'Callahan, and I'm a master's student at Aging Studies here at the university. I have a sort of a multi-part question, or your views on the trends moving away from toward digital currency and not national currencies, the movement away from the petrodollar, and the climate change's impact on insurance and reinsurance companies. It's kind of a global thing.
That is a really big question. So let me just talk a little bit about the central bank digital currency. So what central bank digital currency is it's something that could exist in addition to the paper, or not, it's actually not paper anymore, but the bills on a substrate that we keep in our wallets, right? And so it's something that could exist as a supplement to that, and it's something that is being investigated in central banks around the world. With or without central bank digital currency, a lot of people are used to using electronic means of payment, right? Personally, I carry cash and I carry credit cards, right? So I'm used to both types of transactions. Other people have different patterns in their behavior. Whether or not there ends up being a central bank digital currency, that's a decision that has not been taken yet. In the end, it's a decision by the Department of Finance. But certainly central banks around the world are looking at that issue. I would like to reinforce, though, central bank digital currency is seen as a supplement, as something that would exist in parallel with the bills that we already produce. So that's one thing. That doesn't matter that much for monetary policy, but it is a change. Something that might matter a little bit for monetary policy is more, as climate change comes along, what's going to be happening to just our production chains? Like, are firms going to be having to, is it going to be more costly? What's going to happen? And it's expanding our models so that we can have a better idea of how, as industry responds and changes to changing technology that may be less energy or less fossil fuel intensive, what might that mean for the Canadian economy? We're also managing looking at what might happen if there are more climate incidents, some of those big events. All of those things could impact costs more generally. And so for now, there are things we're mindful of, events that could be on the horizon. We need to be thinking about how to, again, interpret the information. What might that mean for monetary policy? But in the big picture, it's not going to, at this point, change our objectives, right? Because our objective, which is through an agreement with the government, is a 2% inflation target. And we're going to do what it takes to get the rate of inflation back to 2%. But very important that we think about some of the issues that you flagged.
Over here, David. The mic's coming.
Dave Morgan. I guess I'm a University of Regina alumni. I took classes in the likes of Jack Bone and Gordon Church in the 60s. What impact does taxation or taxation policy have on the Bank of Canada's setting of the interest rate? And what advice does the Bank of Canada give to the federal government concerning taxation policy? And what would fit with what your objectives are in the long run, even the short run?
Yeah, so our approach in terms of, it could be tax policy, it could be spending policy. We take government, and when I say government, it's federal, it's provincial, and it's municipal. We try to take all of that as given and then provide, build our view of the outlook based on all of that, based on what governments are doing in terms of tax policy, in terms of spending policy. And so it's one of the inputs into our projection exercise. And then when we put these views of what's happening in the future together, there could be an impact on our policy rate because it's in the context of the entire economy, right? It's one piece that goes in, but we're taking it as given. I think advice is an awkward word here because we're not in the business of providing advice to the government on things that are, frankly, government decisions to be made. So we take what is being done, it feeds into our projections, and then that is what feeds into our decision-making process.
Sharon, maybe I could just follow up a bit on that. And I realize the bank is independent of the government and operates independent of the government. But I'm wondering about kind of the relationship with the Department of Finance and the government generally, but finance in particular. And in the context of sort of counter-cyclical policies, when you have high inflation and whatnot, you're tightening the monetary policy. And so how do you, or can you actually in any way try to coordinate with the federal government on this in terms of so that fiscal policy actually reflects monetary policy? Because if one is working against the other, you lose the effect in some ways.
Yeah, so our approach has been much more, we take the fiscal policy and then set monetary policy. From the fiscal point of view, from the federal point of view, I know the federal government draws on non-government forecasts of the economy as an input into their budgeting process. And so that there is a scope for, in that, what's the outlook going to be? There's a scope for those external forecasters to be possibly, doing, endogenously taking account of things, right? So if the external forecasters are thinking that, okay, well, we're in a world with a policy interest rate of 5% on a nominal basis, and we see the world eventually going to a world with 2% inflation, they're going to be doing their own judgment on what they think we're going to be doing and building that into their own forecasts. So that forecasting process of these external forecasters goes into the Department of Finance. And I don't think coordination is a good word. I'm not claiming that there are not ongoing discussions, because both the Bank of Canada, the Department of Finance, and provincial governments are all very concerned about what is going on in either their provincial economies or in the national economies. So it is important that there's communication and talking, but it's not advice giving and it's not coordination per se.
Yeah.
It's just, again, it's different perspectives on how things are evolving. And so both sides may be able to learn from the other side, but it's not a, okay, let's do this. Let's do this together.
Okay. At the back?
Thanks. My name's Jim Farney. I'm a director here at the school. I guess I want to play off this central bank independence question again. And the 2% target's about 20 odd years old. And obviously we've got much better economic data, so we're more aware of these differential impacts today. I'm wondering, has the bank changed its internal governance and decision-making to better take account of that increase in knowledge, as you're more aware at a fine detail of how interest rate shifts affect people?
So that's a good question. I think what has happened internally within the bank is we are drawing on more sources of information. One simple example, we have a group that, within our Canadian Economic Analysis Department, we have a group that has survey intelligence and regional intelligence, and they have offices in locations outside Ottawa. That was a creation in the late 90s. But what that means is we now have different surveys. We survey businesses on a quarterly basis as part of our Business Outlook survey. We have a survey of consumers, the Canadian Survey of Consumer Expectations. We have Business Leaders Pulse that is more frequent. So that survey means we have more information than we would have had back in 1991 when we had inflation targeting. We have more access to different types of data. I spoke about this anonymized data. By the way, what anonymized data means is that TransUnion, which is where we get this data from, when they give us the data, they strip out any personal information from it, right? So we don't get any information on names or addresses or things like that. So we get a little bit of information that, okay, there is, this one household and a bit of what's going on in terms of their borrowing. So we get this anonymized data that's quite detailed, right? That allows us to do a richer analysis and understand some of the differences that I was talking about today. So what I would say is over the, since 1991, the access to information that we've had has become richer. And with that, the analysis that we are actually doing internally has become richer. We have, before we sit down as a group of governing council to deliberate, we have meetings in advance where staff are giving us views on the outlook, views on financial market developments, views on the international economy. We have a lot of people around the table. We get information again from these regional groups. So that is the context. In terms of the actual governance, our governance has not changed officially in the sense that the Bank of Canada Act lays out the governance. The practice that we've followed for the past 20 years is that we have a governing council with consensus decision making. We don't vote. We have a governor, a senior deputy governor, and four deputy governors together come to consensus on the decision. That allows for a very good back and forth in terms of people learning from each other and delving deeper into the questions. And then we have a consensus decision at the end of that. One small change that we did make recently is one of those deputy governors is now not a full Bank of Canada employee. One of those deputy governors is more like an external representative. No management responsibilities within the bank, is classified as a consultant and weighs in on the monetary policy decisions equally to everyone else. So that is, one way that we're trying to, avoid having I'll call it the misconception that, it's all within the bank thinking, right? Having somebody external come in and say, bringing new ideas and new things to the table. That's the one true change in governance on the decision making. The last thing I'll mention that has changed gradually over time is our communications. That we're trying to improve the way we communicate, which, may or may not have seemed like it today, but it was a little less technical than some of the speeches we've given in the past. So we've tried to make our speeches a little bit less technical. We've tried to do the same thing in our monetary policy report. So it's a little bit more accessible for people. We recently this year started publishing a summary of our policy deliberations. So 2 weeks after we take a decision, we put out a document that provides some additional details behind the scenes of things that we talked about. And that is a new thing for the bank. It's sort of like what minutes look like for other institutions. But for our governance, we call it a summary of deliberations. So we've been trying to do that. We're putting out more information on our website, things like that. So over time, the process has evolved, even as the legal governance structure has not changed a lot.
Maybe I could ask about, when I look at the audience, I think the majority of people here likely didn't experience the high inflation and interest rates of the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, and the real damage it did to the Canadian economy, and effect on people's lives, didn't experience it. So I'm wondering, because so much of economics and I guess monetary policy to agree is expectations, public, the fact that these generations, the last generation or so, didn't go through that period, right? And they've been living in a period of low inflation and low interest rates, and their expectations are that, this is the way the world works. Does that make it more difficult, do you think, for to shift monetary policy when that public attitude is out there with no sort of experience with the 70s and 80s when things were really tough in terms of inflation and interest rates?
Yeah, so I can't speak exactly to what was going on at the individual household level, but certainly, all of our attempts at outreach, all of our surveys, all of that gives us exactly the sense you're talking about, that people were, feeling like, well, we've had low interest rates for a long time, inflation not really a concern for an even longer period of time. That's ideally what we want, the future to be looking like as well, because when we're in that world where people don't have to think about prices moving around much and movements in interest rates as they're trying to work a little against the business cycle being relatively moderate, that's a much easier world to live in. It's easier to plan.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're aiming to get back to a world where people don't need to worry as much about inflation because it's in that 1% to 3% band centered around 2 with some volatility. So, because right now, there's a lot of uncertainty, and we get that. And we're trying to remove the one piece of uncertainty, which is on inflation, that we can.
Okay.
That's the end.
Maybe, is there somebody
Yep.
at the back?
Thank you. My name is Mark Jerry. I'm the president of Luther College here in Regina and also an economist. I'm wondering if you could speak just a little bit about the supply side and sticky wages and contract negotiations happening across the country and sort of balancing that with getting to the 2% target and at the same time pressures on the wage side as we get to that target.
The simple bottom line in terms of, wage negotiations is, this is an agreement between 2 parties, and our one message is we want both of those parties to recognize that we're bringing inflation back down to 2%, right? And so in terms of thinking about what the future brings, the future will be bringing inflation back down to 2%. Because ultimately, again, wage negotiations are between the 2 sides. It's between the labor side, and the employers. And yeah.
There's somebody at the back here.
Thank you. My name is Yuan. I was a graduate here last year. So my question is kind of like Dave talked about the interest rate. So I think earlier this year, the 2 premiers from BC and Ontario, they wrote a letter maybe to the Bank of Canada asking for not raising the interest rate again. I'm just curious, how much influence or will that have an influence to the decision of Bank of Canada? And another question is kind of related. I know Toronto or Vancouver, their housing market is going crazy and they try to cool it down a little bit. But for Saskatchewan, where the housing market isn't that crazy, why there isn't a kind of an interest rate policy to the housing market? Thank you.
Yes, there's a fair amount in that question. In the end, so the thing about the housing that is challenging right now, right? If you look back into 2021, when interest rates were low, there was a housing affordability challenge in many areas of the country, right? House prices were going up rapidly, and it was a housing affordability challenge. Now we're in a world with higher interest rates. There's still a housing affordability challenge, right? And so the reason I use that simple example is it really points to the demand versus supply frictions. That even before COVID, we were, especially in some markets, in a situation where demand was very strong relative to available supply. And when demand is strong relative to supply, you tend to see the prices increase. So, in the end, we need more housing built in Canada, and that's going to solve some of those, particular regional challenges associated with the housing side of things. So that's supply side. is very important. That supply side, is important beyond housing. I'd mentioned some of the challenges that we'd had during the pandemic, where goods were just not getting to market. They were, maybe stuck in transport, but maybe not even getting out of ports because there were waves in COVID that were going in different places at different times. And what did we see? We saw strong demand for some goods. The products weren't getting to the stores because of supply disruptions. That was an environment that contributed to some of the price increases that we saw earlier. And I'm sorry, I forgot the first half of your question. The premiers.
The two premiers. From BC
I mean, the
and
short
Ontario, they have a different
Yeah.
market. Yeah.
Yep. So the short answer to that question is no, those letters do not impact our decision, right? Is the short answer. So let me say why those letters don't impact our decision. Well, because we're actually observing directly the same things that they spoke about in those letters, right? And so we're setting our monetary policy where we're very, we are seeing what they are seeing. And so in that context, and we're hearing, for what it's worth, we're hearing directly from Canadians as well. Canadians do write to us directly. So the fact that they wrote the letters is not something that's going to influence our decisions. We have that information already at hand.
You worked for a time at the Federal Reserve in Washington, so I was just curious, what difference, or do you see differences between the two economies, Canada and the United States, in terms of the response to monetary tightening, here and there, and particularly the household effects? Are there significant differences in terms of how the two economies have responded?
There are very big differences. So one of the reasons that I put the chart up earlier that was, you may or may not remember, it's like the reset chart, the people that have 5-year fixed rate mortgages that after 5 years reset. And right now, they're resetting at about 2 percentage points higher on interest rate than they had been 5 years earlier, right? Why did I put up that chart? That's a big difference. That's why the cash flow channel is something that we're monitoring very closely. In the United States, most mortgages are 30-year fixed rate mortgages. And over time, suppose you had locked in quite a while ago and rates were higher. So clearly they're high now, so I'm talking about a long time ago when rates are higher, right? As rates went lower, you could usually find a way to refinance onto a lower interest rate, right? So that means when interest rates go up, most mortgages in the United States are on the interest rates do not move, the payments do not move. So the cash flow channel is not coming from that mortgage channel in the United States. Just for the other side of things, in Australia, where almost all mortgages are variable rate mortgages, the channel's even stronger than it is in Canada. But the other side of things is credit card debt. Interest rates on credit card debt in Canada, they're high. They don't move. Interest rates in the United States on credit card debt do move. And so in the United States, even while they've had the nice low mortgage rates that haven't moved up as the Fed has tightened monetary policy, the interest rates on credit card debt have moved up. So that means the channels are really different. So in other words, there may be a cash flow channel in the United States, but it's coming through the credit card side of things, not through the mortgage side of things. The credit card side of things, I don't know the data, so I'm not going to speak to that.
Yeah.
Just
Okay.
different channels, yeah.
Right here? Up front row.
Andre Butamoloni. I'm just a high school teacher. You spoke a lot about increasing the interest rates to deal with inflation, but I'm kind of curious to know about what kind of factors would need to be in place for the rates to go down.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So first thing, I have to say this, back in September, well, we're still in September, earlier this month when we made our decision, we chose to not raise rates further, but we expressed a strong concern about the stickiness on inflation. In that sense, we were not then in a situation to be thinking about decreasing rates, right? So that doesn't mean that by 5 years in the future, we're going to be at the same interest rate, right? So what needs to happen? Well, I'm going to go to the end game, right? So the end game, when inflation's back at 2% forward, but it would suggest that our policy interest rate way at some point in the future, could be in that area. So interest rates that other people pay on mortgages and things would tend to be higher than that. Research to understand whether neutral is still where we think it is or whether it might be different. And for those who are interested, I'll just point out that former Deputy Governor Paul Beaudry did give a speech on that topic a little earlier this year, so people can read his speech.
Okay, well, maybe I'll try one more. You talked about all the effects of the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and interest rate policy and whatever. What's the cumulative effect of all that? Like, are these structural changes, and are they impacting the bank's ability to forecast the economy? Like everything that's occurred over the last few years. I mean, a pretty significant change has happened in the global economy.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, so what does that mean for the bank in terms of going forward in its forecasting?
So we've spent a lot of time not just using our models the way they are, but understanding some of the different pieces. And the supply piece is one area where traditionally there wasn't enough detail built into models. So we've been doing a lot of behind-the-scenes analysis to understand what's happening on the supply side. Again, a really simple example, you have a store, it's back in the pandemic, and the government tells you have to close the door. So that store is no longer supplying anything, but when restrictions open up, that store can reopen. Suddenly it's back again.
Yeah.
We started having to distinguish between this concept of supply and this longer run concept of potential output that we normally use because the pandemic was so different. So that's one example of how we had to be agile. We had to think about what was different and what might that mean for our models, right? The other example that I'll point to, and there may be more than this, but just another example, actually two examples, are inflation expectations, right? We need to understand how inflation expectations are behaving. I gave a speech in December last year where I talked very broadly about the importance of understanding what was going on in inflation expectations and the lessons learned from the 1970s about the importance of that. But right now, they're sticky, right? So is inflation. So maybe that's natural. But we need to understand that relationship, and we need to understand if we've got things right in our models. And so that's an example of something where we run different simulations, use our models with different simulations to see what the consequences are. And the third example is exactly off my speech topic today, which is this cash flow channel, right? This cash flow channel is something that was not as important before this episode. Really important this episode, both because higher debt levels and a much larger, low for long, and then a much larger movement in interest rates. So really needing to dig down and use the microdata to help inform us about what was going on and what the impact on consumption would be in this very different environment than what we would have seen previously.
Good. Well, okay, one last question.
Thank you for your presentation and for answering all the questions. My name is Sam Gamtesa from Department of Economics. With the economy doing very well despite this very high interest rate, are we in a situation maybe wherein high interest rate itself is fueling inflation? Are we, inversely we can ask whether the target, 2% target is still viable in this situation? How is Bank of Canada looking at that? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, the 2% target and the high level of interest rates, and aren't those high levels of interest rates feeding back into inflation itself? So the first comment on the 2% inflation target, that is our target. We do have a process, right? Every 5 years, we re-examine our monetary policy framework and whether there should be any changes into it. So I'm certainly not going to prejudge whatever the next agreement says. But we have looked in the past at advantages of higher or lower than 2% inflation targets and found that 2% seemed to be a bit of a sweet spot. It's also where a lot of other countries are aiming. So we're going to do what it takes to get inflation back to 2%. So that is a very important part of the picture. I'm sorry, I totally lost my train of thought on the other half of the question. The housing price. So the housing price side of things. So that's something I spoke a little bit about today. If we drop the mortgage interest cost piece, measures of underlying inflation are only about a 1/4 point lower, which means they're somewhere between 3 and 4 right now, even like totally excluding the mortgage interest cost piece. And again, if we look at how much our price is increasing, how much more than 3, how much more than 5, how much more than 7, all of those numbers are still much higher than is consistent with 2%. So we're not in a position right now where mortgage interest costs are driving inflation. We've got much more broad-based increases in inflation other than just the mortgage interest cost piece. But we do look very carefully at that piece, right? Again, it has a direct impact on a number of households, on their spending patterns, and that matters for the economy. So the final thing that I'm going to say in this is, again, interest rates are high. We have seen effects of our policy. We have seen some slowing in the overall economy, right? Our estimates are that excess demand is coming down. So we have, estimates of excess demand are coming down. Very gradual slowing evident in the labor market, job vacancies coming down. And we've seen some modest increases. The unemployment rate's at 5.5. Overall, we still have an economy that is, I don't want to use the word growing. We still have an economy that, again, with an unemployment rate of 5.5%, that's pretty good, right? And so we are seeing some good signs from the economy even as it's slowing. That's the sort of balance that we're hoping. Again, we want to raise interest rates enough, but not too much. Going forward, have we raised them enough? Don't want to cause undue harm, but do need to get inflation back. So that's sort of how all of these pieces are fitting together.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon. There was a fascinating discussion, and you mentioned, I think at one point about your regional surveys and the bank you keep your eye on. I know, I think it was like 20 years ago, the bank used to have an office in Regina, a regional office. So maybe you'll come back. And
well, we do have a regional office in Calgary.
In Calgary,
and we have
right.
a representative from Calgary in the audience right now.
Yeah, exactly. But Regina maybe someday again, like you used to. At any rate, yeah.